So welcome, everybody, to the Martin E. Segal Theatre Center here at the Graduate Center CUNY, and it is our great honor and privilege to welcome tonight one in the world of chess, one would also say a grandmaster, of the performance art theory, performance art, and someone who was a convener very, very early on of performance studies in the world. So all of you and some of you, I know, are students. This is a real model to study in the soccer world. We say this is a player from a great national team from Brazil. And so let's see what he has to say to us. And I would like to thank Professor Peter Eckersall, who let me know that Richard Gough would be here tonight for the 2014 Daniel Gerould Memorial Lecture. This lecture is in memory of a wonderful friend and colleague, Daniel Gerould. I like to welcome Jadwiga Gerould, who is here with us. Daniel also, over 5 decades, contributed enormously to the field and the study in the world of theater and performance. He was a great worker in the vineyard. He took care of his parcel and property, which was Eastern European theater, Slavic and Eastern European theater, and was the authority worldwide. And as we all know, also Peter Eckersall came here from Australia as a professor of theater for Asian studies and took over his chair. So this is something very, very special for us. And Daniel, whose book I also want to hold up as well, Quick Change. We worked on this together as his essays over 40 or 50 years, which were published in a variety of magazines. And I think we put in 240 illustrations. And it's quite a toss salad, as Richard Schechner wrote in the back introduction, of an interesting way, and also brilliantly written. So I think it's a great model to study. I once heard in China, students have to type first articles from others or retype screenplays if they want to be screenwriters. But if one ever had to do this, for sure these articles would be ones one can choose. Not that I approve of that method. I'm Frank Henschke, the Director of Programs and Executive Director and part of the theater faculty. And we bridge academia and professional theater, international and American theater. Daniel Gerould also was the Executive Director of the Segal Center for a long time. He was Director of Publishing and a great hero of ours and a great supporter. And he helped to make the Theater Center what it is now. The lecture performance will be about 55 minutes. Afterwards, we have a small reception here. Richard, I'm sure, will be able to talk with us also afterwards for some questions and then have a small reception. If you have a cell phone, please just do take it out. And I'll do the same and put it on silent. And now I would like to ask Peter to give a short introduction on the work of Richard and let us more about his.
Thanks very much, Frank, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming along tonight to what I hope is going to be a really interesting and fascinating talk. By way of introduction, I think to begin to introduce Richard Gough, we might begin with the statement bridging the academic programs at the university and the world of theatre making and performance making, because our guest speaker tonight is somebody whose work embodies that and demonstrates that and has been, I think, pioneering the ways in which we might think about performance existing within the academy and the academy existing with performance. And this has been a very long journey, I think, and Richard is one of the pioneering thinkers and scholars and practitioners of this kind of work in our field. Richard has many, many honours, and his complete biography is in the, or not his complete, but a summary of the key points are in the brochure tonight. But if I could just mention a few of them. So Richard Gough is the Artistic Director of the Centre for Performance Research, a multifaceted theatre organisation based in Wales that works internationally. And indeed, I think some of the first times I actually have met Richard have been at late at night at festivals in Australia, where you've been down there sourcing some artists to come and visit Wales in a small town called Aberystwyth, which I'm really proud that I can actually pronounce. which is a slightly remote area, I think, in Wales, but also a very active area. And over the years, I think some of the great names of theatre and performance also know where Aberystwyth is by the fact that they've been there on invitation of Richard. He's the general editor of Performance Research, which is one of the leading performance research journals in our field, if not the leading one in terms of performance research. It's slightly insane. He actually does 6 issues a year now, and if I could just give a shameless plug, I've just co-edited one of the issues on the theme of rupture, which has currently just been out. In fact, I got my email today saying that my essay or my contribution was available now. So, very important journal, and I think a very significant journal in terms of offering the kinds of outputs that might engage with the idea of linking theatre theory to theatre practice. Richard is Professor of Performance Research at Falmouth University and Emeritus Professor at Aberystwyth University, and he was founding President of Performance Studies International, the peak body for performance studies scholars and performance practitioners, an organisation that I also have a very long and pleasant involvement with. I could go on. He's curated a lot of things, he's produced a lot of things, he's directed theatre, he's published articles, and he's also been a very significant figure in setting up and establishing collaborative research projects and enabling other people's research. And tonight he's going to speak on the topic of, much loved topic of Richard's work, Food and Performance, Last Supper's Longing for Commensality. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you. I do have the knee injury, the football knee injury, but other than that, I think the comparisons stop there. But I might be hobbling a little bit, I'm afraid, because I've got a brace here. So, thank you, Frank and Peter, for the invitation to come here. It's a great honour to be giving the memorial lecture for Daniel, someone who sadly I did not know, but whose scholarship I admired greatly. So actually I'm going to end up, it's going to be more the second half of this title that I'm probably going to focus on than the first half. 10 years ago, I was leaving Providence, Rhode Island, trying to check 2 huge bags in through to Manchester and carry 2 more on as hand luggage, containing a bizarre collection of props, costumes, and culinary instruments taken for the devising of a performative banquet at the 11th Performance Studies Conference in Brown. The contents alarm the X-ray operator, and a thorough manual inspection reveals large quantities of syringes, test tube holders, pipettes, and aluminium flasks. Are you a scientist, sir? Thinking that conforming to the impression of an occupation and the research that the objects suggest and represent was the easiest solution to an otherwise complicated explanation, I responded affirmatively. Yes, I said. I am a scientist. It sounded good. I was convinced. Moving on to the next line of Homeland Security, the contents of one of the carry-on bags caused the scanner even greater alarm. Rapidly discovering the inoffensive but stainless steel implement, the security guard began to restuff the bag. He looked up to me and said, "Sir, I couldn't help but notice the wigs. What's with the wigs?" Desperately speculating whether this was an offence, could you be in big trouble for cross-dressing mid-flight or disappearing into a plane's toilet for a makeover, I stumble for words. He says, "I notice they look theatrical and old-fashioned." I'm thinking, oh my God, if he looks in the other bag, I've got 20 pairs of wooden clogs and a weird collection of masks. He says, "Sir, are you a judge?" Then I'm thinking, do they have some sort of sophisticated cross-reference system going on here? If I told the other guy at check-in that I was a scientist 10 minutes ago, can I be a judge at the security gate? Again, I place great confidence in the significance of the objects and the network of meanings they promote. I look at him sternly and say, yes, I am a judge. I've often found that the best way to cut talkative and prying London taxi drivers short is to say that I'm a dentist. It ends all conversation. My best roles are played out in everyday life. Occupations are mutable and easily inhabited. Tonight, I'm mainly going to be a chef, a wannabe chef, with aspirations for philosophy in the kitchen. So, let us start in the kitchen. Let us start with the basics. The domestic kitchen. Virtuosity in the safety of your own home. Can you be virtuosic in private? Does virtuosity need witnesses, listeners? Is it actually a way of being seen or heard? An excited and inflamed contract between the watcher and the watched? An amplification of communication? A flamboyant exchange? Private, unwitnessed virtuosity or not, this is certainly mastery. Mastery of fire and water, techniques of the knife, slicing and cutting, techniques of death, of slaughter, of disemboweling, of gutting and stuffing, an art of transmutation. This is the opening title sequence of Ang Lee's film Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, in which we see Mr. Chu, Taipei's greatest chef, prepare Sunday lunch for his 3 troublesome daughters. A definition of the virtuoso is a person who has a masterly or dazzling skill or technique in any field of activity. But what is skill and what is technique? Skill is special ability acquired by training or technique requiring special training or manual proficiency. But an obsolete use of the word is understanding, with the root of the word being from Old Norse for distinction, also related to difference. Technique is practical method, proficiency in a practical or mechanical skill, a special facility, the knack. So whilst the contemporary use and definition of the words emphasize the practical and the manual, ability and dexterity, the roots lie in notions of understanding, both mentally and physically, and in relation to distinction and difference, what marks one from another, what allows us to recognize a difference, and what draws attention and is thus distinctive. It is these techniques of the extra daily, to borrow Eugenio Barber's term, techniques which require a training, which are learned and developed through a daily practice, and which demand specific release and application of energy. It is these techniques I wish to embark from this evening. Virtuosity is also a surpassing of technique, the attainment of skills, and then the surpassing of those skills, a curious act of devotion and denial. We all witness such moments in theatre, but I'm also interested to explore the passing of technique before the surpassing, the transmission of performance knowledge, and the transformation of performance knowledge. We'll just watch this last section. This will start in a minute. Refined culinary techniques of the domestic kitchen become feats of showmanship in the public arena. On the street, actions speak louder than words. Vying for attention and trade, this makes pizza tossing and the annual flip of a Shrove Tuesday pancake look both mild and tame. This is action of flame and flight, literally flamboyant and vertiginous. Food not only with strong presence, but also with a history of having been airborne. No subtle shades of distinction here, all loud and bold. And actually, I pause, I can't compete with this, so I'll just let you watch a few moments of this. I'll pick it now. So Flying Morning Glories, it's sort of spinach. That's just the warm-up. This is the real thing. Get the tarmac. They do an action replay in a moment, I think. At what point does the exhibition of skill become exhibitionism, extraordinary yet excessive? We tend not to prize the skills of the circus performer, too popular and commercial to be deemed virtuosic. But as in the high wire walker, this action involves risk, panache and courage, danger beyond the attainment of skill. The reality is, it could all go terribly wrong, as the stain on the tarmac gives testament to. A sort of palimpsest of failure, an archaeology of dropped dinners, the split second between nourishment and waste, accomplishment and shame. Sue Hark's film, The Chinese Feast, is a sumptuous tale of passion and rivalry. Here, Master Chef Kit begins to get the measure of what he's up against as the team struggle to outdo the near-magical cooking prowess of the mysterious supergroup. The bald-headed guy is the supergroup. These are the culinary acts of the professional kitchen. Here, competitiveness becomes outright combat. In this mouth-watering film, they proceed to competitively cook the imperial feast. A banquet of numerous complex dishes, an unimaginable fare, including bear paw and monkey brain. But it is the issue of professional rivalry that I want us to focus upon. To what extent is such competitiveness creative, pushing the boundaries, taking risks, pursuing excellence through innovation, an experiment, wishing to go one step further? These are all aspirations that in sport, science and exploration are fundamental, and yet in the arts are often seen as self-indulgent. At best, the domain of the dilettante, a word coincidentally associated with virtuoso in every dictionary definition. What is interesting in this food fight, this kitchen kung fu, is that despite all the ever more outrageous techniques and effervescent displays of ability, the emphasis remains on a description of taste. The proof is in the pudding, or in this case, the crispy noodles with beef. Music, dance, and theatre. I hope it's clear this evening when I'm talking about food, I'm really almost talking about theatre. Likewise, have to function despite technique, engage their audience, challenge them, disturb them, and stir their imagination, both heart and mind. Flamboyant, so this is the crispy noodles with beef. Flamboyant technique, excessive display of ability alone can collapse upon itself, become redundant, dislocated, and deracinated. In the Chinese feast, the food not only looks good, but tastes good. So now they have to return this opening moment. I'll just let it play a moment. It's actually not a very well-known film, this, even within sort of gastro film circles. But it gets even more sort of splendid as it works its way through, just in terms of the techniques that they're displaying. So, it's a sort of food pornography of sorts, I imagine. So, here are some images of Ferran Adria's creations across 20 years. Ferran Adria, the chef, the Spanish Catalan chef from El Bulli in Spain. To eat at El Bulli was to surrender to a sensorial onslaught, disorientating, disturbing, and utterly thrilling for the mind and the belly, a game of surprise and thwarted expectation, generating bewilderment and enchantment. 30 dishes served across 4 hours at a dynamic pace with arresting interludes and shocking revelations. The chef as dramaturg, linking sections and sequences in unpredictable ways, mutating, adapting, betraying food traditions, creating roots through material beneath foundations, in subterranean conduits, channels and canals, and in the air, in the imagination, establishing networks and a matrix of meaning within the web of the performance, dinner, for the imaginings of the spectator, lacing threads through the fabric of the meal, performance, in the weft and weave like channels of irrigation, canals and aqueducts, subterranean streams, nurturing interseeds between nodes and operandi, integrating the courses without reduction or simplification by means of imbrication and layering, through intertwining. His work is a supreme model for theatre, a deconstruction of an entire meal and of a single dish, and a reimagining of dining and commensality, an undoing and a reforming. To rescale reality can be a subversive strategy, to undo so as to understand. This is the work of another Spanish food artist, Alicia Rios. Eat London or Eat Melbourne, there could be an Eat Manhattan, there have been several editions, is in part a project of undoing reality within a fabulous Spanish surrealist tradition. To see what you have never seen before, to upturn the mundane and habitual response of, I have seen this before, I have been there, it was as expected. For once, to see the entire city and its civic spaces as edible, to see its honourable institutions and historic monuments as a confection, to see structures of power, legislation and commerce as unstable, fragile delicacies that will rot if not consumed, to eat the Houses of Parliament, to devour Buckingham Palace, to gorge on the Strand, to maul the Mall. The assembly of the edible micro-city within the city's own centre, in London it was Trafalgar Square, through the 2 by 2 metre square sections being wheeled in from various embarkation points via a complex web of routes arriving at the destination from all points on the compass, was an event in itself, a carnival of disruptive flotillas, as was the 30 minutes to meander around the perimeter of the three-dimensional jigsaw to admire the accuracy in scale and detail, and to realize the variety of material from which it was constructed. And then the invitation to devour, to destroy, a public feeding frenzy of mass proportions watched by the lions at the foot of Nelson's column, a Monopoly game board turns smorgasbord, becomes exhibition and becomes buffet and banquet. A great moment of public art in the public domain, but it is the process of making and collectively democratically conceiving that I want to draw our attention to. To create this event, a wide variety of ethnic and community groups of disability art workers, activists, elderly and homeless people came together, were volunteered and were recruited. The city was divided into manageable proportions, and through a process of consensus, the 30 or so different groups chose their section, reduced and rescaled it to a 2 by 2 meter sections. In preparation, they went on walks, surveying, analysing and scrutinising their patch, plot, turf, looking at every building and landscape as if it were edible, imagining how it might taste, how they would like it to taste. Given total freedom to build their section from whatever food they wished, and were offered expert advice, consultation, chefs, and kitchens. This was a project that took months in planning and preparation, was decimated within the hour, but resides in the memories of many and changed the perception of the civic space and the radical potential of the public sphere. I just pause on the image of my own work that you're familiar with. I once wrote a paper for a conference adapting a structural engineer's report on a building, an analysis of the efficacy of theatre and its relation to communities and the public sphere. I set out to evaluate the stability of theatre, its infrastructure and function, and to see if it were fit for purpose in a situation going forward, to use the terminology of these neoliberal times. I presented the report as if a qualified engineer, another profession assumed, with expert knowledge, and I got more immersed in my own conceit and the uncanny relevance of engineering terms to the current state of theatre, the modulus of elasticity, structural failure, underpinning, surface cracks, hydration, false work and scaffold, pile, foundation, delamination, perilous decay, and subsidence. In the conclusion of my structural report, I confirmed that theatre had suffered from subsidence, that it was in danger of becoming detached and dislocated from society, that the bedrock upon which it had been constructed had undergone seismic shifts and catastrophic collapse, leading to liquefaction. This is where solid material becomes like liquid. The outhouses and annexes to theatre were also in a deleterious state and needed to be reconstructed. But the problem of the suspension upon which theatre is built is very real. There is no rock to underpin, to pile down to. The liquefaction had been total. This is in stark contrast to the public sphere that is built on rock. Theatre functions through a suspension of disbelief. Even the presentation of the real is an aesthetic style as conventionalized as naturalism of 100 years previously. Work in the public sphere, however, best functions without such suspension, but the techniques and strategies of theatre, in any case poised to collapse, can be uprooted and applied. I will make a short expansion. Theatre enjoys being regarded as subversive and dangerous, but is it more a threat to etiquette, social norm and behaviour, functioning within diminishing coteries, private circles, and increasingly for a cognoscenti? One reads of riots within theatres historically. Usually these are in response to form and content, subject and aesthetics, but rarely do these riots spill out of the safe confines of a theatre building. Unrest is contained. The fabric and material structure remains sound, robust, unfractured, non-porous. Attempts to incite revolution, direct action or change in society with immediacy and in response to the events on stage or in the auditorium, to turn the audience into a crowd and the crowd into a mob, inevitably fail. Recall Julian Beck and Judith Malina. and their valiant, undaunting, and untiring attempts to pursue the revolution beyond the stage of a living theatre production as a continuation of the performance. Rarely did the momentum last beyond the foyer. The inspired participant audience, now liberated and mobilized, soon dispersed in the fresh air of the street, dissipated by brutal reality. It was safe inside the theatre. It was possible inside, and within the realm of the imagination. Theatre makes it so. Theatre's private circle has limited impact within the public sphere, at least not directly so. And this is perhaps theatre's most potent subversive strategy, to function as both a crucible and a training ground, to stage rehearsals for a revolution, to train a different way of thinking, to develop strategies and practical actions to make the familiar unfamiliar. It is a way of thinking, subversive, literally playful. Often theatre people and performance makers, dramatists, actors, directors, scholars, and are deeply political beings with sharply focused political sensibility. And often they are more effective politically through direct action, through engagement in the public sphere, than through their work in the theatre. But perhaps it is the technique, skills and craft learnt through theatre that enables them to be so. It is the process of making theatre and the extrapolation of those processes that has the greater potential to affect change in the public sphere than the works themselves. The artistic project itself. I do not simply mean skills in public speaking, rhetoric or oratory, or techniques of persuasion. I mean a way of thinking, of perceiving visually and spatially, collaboratively and processually, strategically and tactically, scenographically, choreographically, and in the application of an expanded notion of dramaturgy. Perhaps theatre is itself a rehearsal space, a training ground for action in the public sphere and in specific communities. In the old joke, if all the world's a stage, where's the rehearsal room? This promise gains currency in the sense that theatre could be the studio for rehearsals for change, social change and citizenship, the reapplication of its techniques of production, the appropriation of its methods, a reinvention of the theatrical without drama but with crisis. Is this not what we have witnessed in recent years? My own perception of what theatre and performance could be was shaken, stirred and tested by spending all night and then the following 6 nights in Jema El Fina, the Square of the Dead, in Marrakesh, Morocco, when I was 18. This challenged all notions of narrative and normative structure. Thinking I was destined to direct plays, place at university to study theatre secure, interest in Beckett and Pinter assured, the predominance of Western drama unquestioned, at the Jema El Fina, I experienced an epiphany and I underwent a crisis. I became illiterate on purpose. Challenged by all that I saw, I felt the thrill of unbounded performance. A decentered matrix of shows and turns, the storyteller here, acrobats there, soothsayer, dentist, barber, the old lady with a table full of herbs, the bearded man with a strange collection of objects, musicians, percussionists, singers, snake charmers, ice sellers, food stalls. I could list 100 strange happenings, and it still would not capture the sensorial bombardment that was mesmerizing, intoxicating, and deeply disturbing, challenging to the very core. It was as if 100 theatres had become porous, and the events had flowed out and flooded the square. The narratives, the characters, the stories were all mixed up, and any one night I could construct an extraordinary necklace of performance shards and strands. It changed me and opened a door of perception. Even now, I think of Jama' el-Fana as a sort of paradigm and a paradox. It exists as a seemingly open space of citizenship and civility, but with certain madness blown in from the desert. I know it has changed, become homogenized and less unrestrained, but still a place where people can speak their minds and speak openly through play and display, and where reality can bend, become distorted in scale, and can be seen differently, undone and apart. But how is a world view of theatre and performance nurtured and encouraged? As a child, growing up in a small village in North Wales, I used to collect stamps. It's a brave man who admits to having been a philatelist. Outings to cities enabled small packages to return home, there to be sorted, organised and rearranged in a reverse taxonomy guided by Atlas, Globe and Stanley Gibbons' catalogue. I reconstructed the world geographically and historically and became acquainted with its outer reaches. As the philatelist's drive became more serious, so the need to specialise became apparent. Not content with the still far too broad fields of British Commonwealth, or Canada, or Australia, I focused more sharply. I chose Nyasaland. It is curious to me that I should have the wisdom to specialise at such an early age and to discover the virtue and wonder of restricting one's field of study. Later, Peter Brook's advice to encourage discipline and structure in order to allow a creativity in theatre would have great resonance and nostalgia for me. Now, a confirmed, incorrigible generalist, I envy the discipline of my earlier calling. The decision with regard to the collection pursued to the limits had two effects. One, collecting now had a diminishing return, with only several hundred stamps to assemble. Nyasaland is what is now Malawi, so there was very few stamps in that period. Two, I became rather more playful with the stamps, countries and cultures that were no longer in my field of vision, that were no longer valuable or collectible. I began to construct new commonwealths, new continents and new colonies. I even began to graph stamps together in a project of hybridization born from reading H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau. It was only recently that I came across the work of Donald Evans, the American artist who painted stamps of non-existent countries. These are beautiful. If you're aware of them, they're exquisite. Miniature, stamp-like size. A fabulous project of imagining, speculation, and provocation, wryly commenting on colonialism, imperialism, and nationalism. As Raymond Williams once said, "Every time I hear the phrase national culture, I reach for my fancy dress." Perhaps that reach can be extended. Perhaps there are very positive aspects to confusion in the way that there are also with regard to insecurity. My own secure grasp of the world was certainly shaken by the Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral. I went to school at Hereford. As a schoolboy at Hereford, I had to walk past it every day for 7 years. This is the most extraordinary complete world map made in 1242 that follows the medieval and classical construction of maps with a division of the world into Asia, Africa, and Europe, with Jerusalem in the center. But by a terrible mistake, at the end of the entire process, the cartographer misnamed the central sections. The east section, Africa, appears as Europe, and the west section, Europe, as Africa. It contains extraordinary descriptions of places and ideas through the elaboration of a bestiary and a set of ideograms. So when you find Crete, for example, you also see the labyrinth. I often loitered, staring transfixed at this fabulous map, an exercise in fantasy and magic realism, which I was only really to understand later when I read Borges and Gabriela Garcia Marquez and saw the small boxes and miniature installations of Joseph Cornell. And I'm going to let this slide sit there for a while now. 20 years after Marrakesh, I'm on the edge of Khartoum, Sudan. I'm standing in a circle, transfixed by what I'm seeing, shoulder to shoulder with other men all in white jalabas, the chants falling and rising. I'm unable to understand the sequence of events unfolding before me. The ones inside the circle who are spinning, a young man who seems to be out of control, the dust rising, the old man in a green cloak, necklace upon necklace of beads, standing on the step of the cemetery, surrounded by others in a multicolored coat of rags, visited by many. This is extraordinary. I feel the same rush of excitement I had all those years before at Jama el-Fana. I am present at something intensely alive, realized in a frenzy, creating an ecstatic performance that makes all our talk of the performative seem insipid and sterile. I feel a hand firmly grasp my shoulder. I turn to see the erudite an exceedingly polite professor of Arabic drama. We had met earlier that morning. He beckons me away from the circle. I am torn and leave reluctant, anxious not to miss the next stages of the zikir ceremony. Away from the circle now, the chants fading, he turns and asks in a rather conspiratorial tone, "Professor Gough, would you tell me, please, what is the latest play of Sheila Delaney?" The situation is so awkward. I mean, many of you probably don't know. Sheila Delaney was a dramatist in the 60s working at the Royal Court. Had big success with her plays in the 60s. The situation is so awkward. I want to experience the zikir. This is my only chance. I was only there on one particular Friday. I cannot be impolite. I know so little about English playwrights. The juxtaposition of situation to question borders on the surreal, but he does not relent and asks also of Angelico. But to explain Angelico's shift from the Royal Court and the development of the community play movement in the shadow of Omanduraban Cemetery, with 500 men in the background participating in the most extraordinary ritual I've ever encountered, was utterly bizarre. He had spent 4 years at Cambridge in the 60s and was anxious for news. And in any case, did not entirely approve of this Sufi ceremony. I had rejected so much of my early interest in plays and playwrights since Marrakesh, proudly proclaiming to be illiterate on purpose. Now I desired to be engulfed in a ritual ceremony that stretched my experience of performance. Later that night, Mr. Gore, our host, presented a paper which attempted to explain the zikir ceremony and other Sudanese ritual practices within the frame of Western drama and in terms of classical European aesthetics. Ideas of representation and catharsis ingeniously overlaid, resulting in a beautiful confusion, which had to be admired for its audacity. Why was Mr. Gore, a South Sudanese, a practicing Sufi, employing European notions of drama to apprehend and explain an African Islamic ritual? Because there was nothing else at his disposal? Question mark at the end. This led to an animated discussion about performance studies and whether it would be a better vehicle to describe and analyze the ritual discussed. Was this me at my proselytizing worst? As the then president of Performance Studies International, was I just another sort of missionary in Sudan? In this situation, performance is perhaps a better optic with which to view the natural native performance of Sudan. Performance studies embraces diversity and difference. It places all that is on the periphery of Western drama and theatre studies in the centre, or rather attempts to avoid the imperialistic notion of centre. It operates on the boundaries and borders of disciplines and militates towards an interdiscipline, eager to comprehend the performances of other cultures on their own terms. What does it mean to act responsibly? As theatre makers, We know how to construct beginnings, middles, and endings. We know how to create narratives, how to represent reality, restore behavior, embody meanings, illustrate history and social situations, and illuminate a people's aspiration. But do we know well enough how to open up the process of theatre, to create holes in the text, to rupture the spectacle, score, tear, and puncture narratives, to arrest the action in time, to allow space for alternative endings and a return to the beginnings? Shakespeare said that theatre holds up a mirror to nature, and Brooke said, let that mirror be concave to focus reality, scrutinize it, and allow truth to emerge. Perhaps what I have in mind here is a hall of distorting mirrors, where reality bends and cracks, and different versions of the truth appear. That truth, whose truth, that can be held up to power. In those mirrors, the body, the situation, the community is distorted playfully. Through laughter and tears, it is also possible to see the whole picture turned upside down. But how does one know another culture? Is to dance, the form of another tradition, an indication that knowing, feeling, embracing another culture and understanding is any closer, nearer, or more possible in this day and age? Following a standard British education, the values of English drama and the dominance of the play and the playwright was inculcated in me, but I rejected, or rather contested, all that education taught me about privilege, Eurocentricity, and the supremacy of English dramatists. It still astonishes me how few drama or theatre departments in the UK embrace a world view of theatre and performance, and I know this is also partly true for the States and the rest of Europe. A few years ago, at a gathering of the UK Drama, Theatre and Performance Studies professors, and as part of a much longer keynote paper, I set them a test, a quiz, to challenge their Western theatre bias. It went like this. 1. Other than Chikamatsu, name a Japanese playwright who wrote for the bunraku and kabuki stage. 2. What are the roots of candomblé? 3. Which came first, kunju or jinju? 4. Name an Islamic playwright. 5. Who wrote the Natya-Shustra? And that's a trick question. 6. What is the song epic narrative form of traditional Korean theatre called? 7. In what part of Africa is the Yoruba found? And can you name a Yoruban playwright? 8. Name 3 no plays. 9. What is the difference between Lakadami and Natyadami? 10. Name 3 Australian theatre companies. I did actually. I'm not going to ask you to answer these. There's only one question that most of them could answer, which probably is not surprising, which is Walisi Inca as a Yoruban playwright, but the rest almost nil. Or, and this you have to remember that in Britain, the questions are very much set around Shakespeare. When Shakespeare wrote, blah, 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 what happened? So, or, just as an example to reverse the questioning and evoke the standard British reference points, the answer is Shakespeare, the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. The question would have been, who was a contemporary of Chinese playwright Tang Jinzhu, and which play was possibly written in the same year as Peony Pavilion? Theatre history describes how time and time again one highly developed, specific, peculiar and idiosyncratic set of theatre practices and aesthetics has had formative and transformative influence on another nation's theatre culture, import, impact. Is this a form of viral transmission? Does the export and import of theatre lead to a form of contamination, infection in the most positive sense, a challenge to the old and the known, the tried and the tested, a challenge to complacency and tradition, inspiration for the new, an alternative view, an opening of the doors of imagination, an incorporation of new techniques and aesthetic practices, renewal, renaissance, and regeneration? And if so, where does that leave the endemic, the native, the traditional, the specific, and the local, the located? What can the relationship be between innovation and tradition, the homegrown and the imported, and what is lost when it is especially and purposefully made for export, sanitized, packaged, and marketed? I think here of the export brew, the beer that is specifically made to travel and remain stable and similar wherever it is drunk in the world. And yet the beer or wine or theatre we most want to drink and savour is the local, and a whole sequence of locals from around the world that is specific and peculiar of the terrain and terroir, the sense and taste of place, rooted, culturally specific. How do we satisfy these seemingly contradictory desires? Now I move into the final phase. He's putting his hand into the frying pans. All 6 burners are alight. He's moving ingredients to one pan to another, tenderly, sensually, efficiently. We witness craft, skill, and virtuosity, but it is not showmanship we see. We see it as performance, as choreography, as art, but this is a process of transmutation by knife and fire, cutting and cooking, not for display, not for visual effect, but primarily for the impact on taste and smell. Of the many extraordinary culinary events witnessed and consumed during the conference Points of Contact, Performance, Food and Cookery, the demonstration by Franco Torruccio, Wales's foremost chef, was the most beguiling. I had invited him to give the antidote to all celebrity chef cookery demonstrations, to work in silence, without explaining or talking up the process, and to make with 2 assistants in a demonstration kitchen his favourite 3-course meal. 100 people watched, mesmerised, dribbling at the mouth. This moment and the entire conference has influenced my work over the last 20 years in making performance work that functions on the border between edible installation and performative banquet, table and stage, participant and witness, forager and fed. So I'm just going to play some slides of, this is all of my own work now, and you might have questions at the end about that. The conference explored food in performance and food as performing art, the performative in cookery, its staging in the kitchen and at the table, the processes in cooking and performance making, exploring piquant analogies and correlations, the theatricality of food, and food as a model for theatre, multisensory, processual and communal. We wanted to bring together artists, chefs and scholars from several cultures in an interdisciplinary collaboration, and we promised that participants would enjoy an immersion experience at the intersection of food and performance, theory and practice. Often, in my own performance work with food, the edible element is not so fancy, except when I can get a few heads of people to serve up. Budgetary restrictions usually call for innovation in presentation, in the manner in which the humble food is served and presented. Uncanny, surreal, disorientating, disturbing, playful, or in the way in which circumstances dictate how it should be eaten, blindfold, only by fingers, with 1 meter-long forks, spoon fed to a stranger, by mouth from a syringe. Necessity being the mother invention, how the modest food is framed and how it is shared and consumed, often collaboratively. What better model for co-participation and co-creation? This is where I've developed various artistic techniques. In any case, in my own performance work, food is a means of communication, a vehicle for generating communities, for extending the performative and the participatory, sometimes leading to a sense of belonging, collectively celebrating, transforming, even communitas. My interest is mainly focused on commensality, conviviality, and intimacy. Commensality, the practice of eating together, or forming a momentary and ephemeral community through eating, through participating and sharing, sometimes feeding another in an act of kindness, reminiscent of childhood, or caring for the infirm and elderly, of transgressing usual distance, coolness, detachment, weariness and cynicism through the act of feeding, foraging and co-feasting, collaborating through consumption. The food can be robust, honest fare, unadulterated, unpretentious, inelegant. Sometimes it has simply been staple food, bread, honey, oil, water, salt, eggs. It is what is done with it, how the food acts and turns, and how the participants perform to complete the action, gain sustenance, and enter the game of imagining, visioning, and realizing. So the aluminium flasks, once again. And just for this very last section, I just want to remind you of Gabriel Axel's film, Babette's Feast, based on Isaac Denison's Karen Blixen's short story, an early example of gastro-cinema that portrays anything but simple food, rather the initially cautious consumption of a sumptuous classic French banquet by the pious and abstemious Christians of remote West Jutland, Denmark, who, out of fear of devilry and the sin of sensual luxury, have formed a pact not to mention the food whilst eating it, and to suppress all signs of pleasure. This austere plan is doomed by the power of food and wine to self-imposed resistance. As the food consumed, so is the Protestant distrust and self-sacrifice. The delicacies and delights cause a mystical redemption. Conviviality emanates, old wrongs are settled, love rekindled. The connections between the olfactory and gustatory to memory are well established and well documented. Smell and taste are strong and sometimes overpowering triggers for memories. On occasions, pleasurable, nostalgic, whimsical, and romantic. At times, terrifying, traumatic, and unbearable. For Proust, his Madeleine instantly evoked memories and emotions from childhood. There is no selection process operating here. We are hardwired from smell to memory to emotion, and 80% of taste is dependent upon a capacity to smell, to sense smell. In Western culture, smell is the most undervalued of all the senses. The demotion of smell in Western culture, in line with the advances of rationalism and sanitation, would appear to be a concurrent with a similar deodorization of theatre that occurs with naturalism. Smell is enjoying a renaissance in both theatre and scientific research. The relationships between smell, taste, and performance are diverse, as are its historical precedents. In my own work, I investigate the olfactory and gustatory in performance as an aesthetic or an representational strategy, as a potential for new performance work, as well as in performative aspects in daily life, and in discourses about smell and taste, especially in regard to identity, commodification, psychology, neurology, medicine, therapy, and environmentalism. The connection between food and emotion, taste and consumption, from bonhomie to well-being, to overexcited enthusiasm, to uninhibited passion, to reckless amorousness and crazed infatuation, has long been the stuff of literature, and especially magic realism, advanced by Gabriela Garcia Marquez. The literature on aphrodisiac food is immense. So too the evidence of taste and smell in relation to food disorders and childhood trauma. But I'm more interested in the micro level of food, taste, memory, and emotion, how the simple breaking of bread and dunking in olive oil and salt can trigger memories and emotions of home, family, culture, and country. Performance studies advanced a way of apprehending the world as if it were theatre, to see all human endeavour as performance. The virtuosic transformations in the kitchen and the social interactions in the restaurant aligned and colluded with such projections and extrapolations, dramatically repeat, flamboyant and spectacular, audacious and iconoclastic, and also shockingly minimalist, contemplative and confrontational, often outstripping the performative in performance art, sometimes more theatrical than theatre, embracing and advancing dramaturgy, choreography and scenography through a co-participation of diner and dinner, of the eaten and the eater, intimate, private, provocative, innovative, igniting the imagination, stirring memory and emotion, disturbing customs and identities, filling the mind and the belly, engaging all five senses, what fuller embodied practice, and yet also social, convivial, nurturing civility, hospitality, gratitude and grace, and demanding co-participation, generating commensality. But what if we turn the lens the other way round? What if we apprehended theatre as if it were food? What if we understood theatre composition through a culinary optic, performance as if it were a form of cooking, the kitchen as laboratory, the studio as laboratory, the studio as kitchen, technique as mastery of material, with precision and dedication, alacrity and respect, the preparation of subsistence, of necessary nourishment, invigorating sustenance, food of the gods, as if manna from heaven. And just in my very final paragraph, sorry, this is a bit clunky, it's just we couldn't get these videos to play. I can talk about this film a bit later, I won't say now. Theatre as if it were a strange food from another world, that like one of Ferran Adria's creations, provoking bewilderment, rekindling enchantment, inspiring awe and curiosity, lo and behold, as if it were a miraculous food, to be shared not just through an act of collaboration and co-participation, but as an act of commensality, of being together to share and partake. Theatre as if it were manna necessary in times of wilderness, alienation and social upheaval, appearing on the stage like a hoar frost, tasting like bread tempered with oil, like flour with honey, a foam, a suspension of seeds, seeds of change for perception and the imagination, as if we might digest theatre, as if we might devour theatre. What if? As if. As. Thank you.
So much, Richard, for such a really extraordinary, outstanding kind of manifesto, I think. A manifesto that I think touches on aspects of performance that are very close to our program, particularly the focus on diversity and interculturalism. All of our students could answer those questions, I think. But I think it touches on so many questions about the way that we experience and understand and experience sensation, I think, and sensation and sensibility, and how those are very important words to our understanding of performance as well. And there's a link to, I think, process. I worked in kitchens as a young actor, and I immediately connected it to theatre because of the temporality of the experience and the fact that it's a bit like being backstage. You have to deliver, and you have to deliver on time, and you have to remember the order of things and so on and so forth. And there is this front. I remember being in the kitchen once where the chef had made French onion soup and the onions were bad. There's no way that you can tell that your French onion soup's going to be bad when you make it. If the onions are bad, even the best chef cannot tell that until it's made. And we had a big party in there, a wedding party, and he'd made this huge vat of French onion soup. And it's quite an expensive restaurant. The guy came in and said that the soup's terrible. And the chef just stood there and said, no, it's not. That's how it's supposed to taste. And, he was not going to back down. He knew, I mean, he said afterwards that it was terrible. It was one of those theatrical moments of absolute front and like an actor who's misperformed on the stage, they'll never admit it to the public.
So maybe he paid with slightly faulty money.
Yeah, maybe the check bounced. I think we could talk about this in many, many different ways. I appreciated the initial focus on spectacle and technique and training and presentation and performance and framing of the theatricality. I appreciated the kind of middle course with the focus on the mapping of knowledge and the mapping of space and of time and of history. And then the third course, I guess, through this, I think, very powerful statement about the need for theatre to re-engage with sensation, not just as an aesthetic act, but also as a very strong political one as well. And so you were very, very much connecting, I think, the politics with performance with the sensation of performance there in your talk. So thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes now for questions, and then we're going to actually have some food. So some very minimal food. But so if anybody would like to, we need to use this microphone. So, yeah.
There are two examples in the 30s of leaving the theater and going out into the street that were pretty effective. Waiting for Lefty, the taxi strike. There was a lot of ruckus on Broadway that night. And the Orson Welles production that wasn't allowed to have a stage, they did it in the audience, and I'm sure that was almost a Pirandellian type of reality, changing people when they left. Cradle Will Rock, yeah. So it was an audience.
Then there's Artaud's radio play that they wouldn't put on to finish with the Judgment of God. And he was pretty much of a revolutionary.
Yes, certainly, but I would still question whether. I mean, Artaud was a visionary in that sense. Yes, and I mean, in a way, interestingly, the taxi strike. It's happening the other way around, isn't it? Isn't it impacting on theatre rather than theatre causing a change in that way? But I hope it was clear. I wasn't trying to devalue theatre in that way. On the contrary, I was sort of saying that what we learn, how we learn to make work, has perhaps greater application outside of theatre, and that in a way, and I hope I was clear, I wasn't really just talking about public speaking or oratory. I was really wanting to focus on a way of thinking, which I think relates very much. We had a class on Monday here at CUNY about dramaturgy, and thinking dramaturgically in an extended way beyond, far beyond notions of being a literary advisor, into how you stage action on stage, but also off stage and outside the theatre. And that's sort of where I've become more and more interested, really. That, I mean, in China, we have some colleagues at the Shanghai Theatre Academy who, in my view, have actually taken a slightly wrong step in the application of performance studies for almost commercial well-being, how to train corporate training. I'm not really interested in that. I was hoping that there are aspects of the rehearsal process being a rehearsal for revolution, which was, in a way, Rustam Baruch's, one of Rustam's early books was titled that.
I think it's very interesting too. You showed some images of the food events where they remake the city in food, and how popular those kind of food festivals now are. In New York, there's one annually, I think, where you get special reduced prices to really top restaurants. And in many places now, there's a time of the year where people go and, they empty the street and they put tables in the street. And they actually have to, I think, urban societies recreate some of the feeling of the Moroccan square that you were showing.
That's interesting, because I'm in the process of editing a book on Alicia Rios's work. Interestingly, I've had quite a lot of discussion with her, because aesthetically, I actually find it quite kitsch, very kitsch, what's being made.
With Vegemite sandwiches.
Yeah. There's some very weird, and if you actually eat it, you have it's almost, actually, on one level, it's sort of pure Marinetti futurism, in that you're sort of eating the whole meal backwards in a weird sort of way. But again, what's really important to that is the process. I mean, when she works with these teams, and they really are from extraordinary range of people across the city, and they look at the Houses of Parliament, and they talk about, they go on little sort of research cells and talk about it, and then discuss, well, how might it taste, and what, it really is quite subversive once you begin to look at the Empire State Building as edible, and how might you construct it? So that side of the work of the process that goes before. The event itself is celebratory and a sort of public kitsch in a way. But then the mass devouring of it is extraordinary how people really have no idea where some of that's been cooked. And yet they destroy it within 30 minutes.
Comments or questions? We have to use the microphone because we are recording it, yeah.
Hi, just to go back to the point about the idea that theatre can be a rehearsal for revolutionary acts, and the idea that the way that we learn to make theatre is that kind of rehearsal process. I was just wondering your thoughts on whether that flows over to the audience, and if so, how much, and also whether interactivity has any role in that in terms of making interactive performance. Does that allow the audience into that more or less, or yeah? Yeah,
it's a really interesting question, because I had to cut a large. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Ferran Adria, who some of you will know actually has now closed his restaurant, and is really working in a very experimental way through a foundation. And that reminded me actually of Grotowski, of Grotowski's decision no longer to make performances, because actually what was required was to involve the audience as participants in a more direct way to understand the processes. So in a way, what I'm suggesting there is that actually, I think there is, of course, even when, I personally, I don't like this idea of becoming, of audience participation. I'm one of the people that will not sit in the front row like you've done. I'll sit at the back there because I don't want to be drawn up, even though a lot of the work that I make involves audience coming up. But I hate it when you sort of put on the spot in that way. So there is that aspect of, even when you're seeing a show in a conventional theatre, of course you're still participating. You're still very engaged through your imagination. But I think to really pursue some of those ideas of how the techniques can be developed and applied outside of theatre, you need to be involved in the process of making theatre. And in a strange sort of way, that was the point that Grotowski got to, was feeling actually, even though he was dealing in very intimate ways with just 100 members of the audience, and they were taking through an extraordinary experience, ultimately he began to feel, no, I need a more direct way of engaging them in the process. Hence then the whole phase of work after theatre. In a way, again, I'm very fascinated to see how Ferran Adria, now that he's almost decided that actually to pursue the experiments with food and foodstuffs and the imagination, he no longer needs a restaurant. Because in a way, the day-to-day need of running a restaurant was so demanding. Even though he only ever opened it for 6 months when he did run it, he's now closed it completely and is working in a much more sort of laboratory way that has a lot of fascinating links with some of the 70s, 80s laboratory work.
The link there might be to Artaud is the alchemical and the transformative process. We've got time for one more question.
This is kind of a two-parter. One is, I was thinking about your experience in Marrakesh and how you saw it as this amazing performance tableau. And I'm thinking of other people who were just there to buy an apple and just considered it all just a real pain because it was so noisy and people were in the way and all this. And what you might do to transform their perception so that they could enjoy the theater of the square as much as you were able to. And then in your discussion about theater getting out into the public, if you could talk a little bit about Boal and how you think he did in that regard.
Well, on the first point, curiously, I think if you're going to go and buy the apple, you'd do that slightly earlier in the day. Because what certainly what I experienced when, I mean, I'm talking 40 years ago when I went there. No, I didn't. There was there. You didn't need any drugs. It was so intoxicating what was happening. But I'm really talking about what was beginning to happen in that square in the early evening. So in a way, the souk is all still behind. But really, it really was a case of this sort of madness blown in from the desert and this extraordinary array of performances, some of which weren't really some of which were straightforwardly acrobatic, song, snake charming, some of which became slightly more touristy, although at that point there really weren't many tourists wandering around. Now it's very different. So it was really more just the mix of events, the way that you could stay there all evening and just wander from one station to another and just sort of do your own mix, really, and go back the next night and just have a completely different experience. In that sense, it really was like wandering and getting lost in the souk that's behind in the same way. On the second part, on Boal, I'm not an expert on Boal. We did have the joy to host him in Wales, in Cardiff for 2 weeks. And work with our own company, and some of the invisible theatre work that he did then was extraordinary and fascinating in terms of what it confronted in the attitudes of people. I remember Susan Vidler, who's now she makes films, but she was in our company. I can't say she's a big film star, but she's a vegetarian, took her rabbit to the market in Cardiff to ask it if they would kill it because she had no money. And this was one of these were the sort of ways that Boal played on that idea of invisible theatre, where you would call the situation was then what was discussed in the little group of people that surrounded about whether the butcher should kill her rabbit. And it was that intention of creating micro controversies in public arenas. And in that sense, I admired the work greatly, and what he took our own company through was amazing in those two weeks. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's been an extraordinary conversation and discussion, so we thank you very much for your talk and for the questions and comments, and please join us now for some pretzels and wine. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming, and I hope you will join us. Thank you.